Okay, welcome to podcast number 5, where today we are discussing home learning and front-loading learning. I'm Jonathan Watson. I'm here with Jonathan Huddleston as usual.
Hello there.
Hello. So Jonathan, I've obviously, come across all the research that says that obviously effective home learning adds more than a grade to students' GCSE performance. So I thought it would be useful if I could ask you, it's all very well having that, but how can we achieve that? So first and foremost, what's the kind of correct purposes of home learning?
Oh, well, I mean, to be honest, the problem you find, I think maybe the best thing is look at what are the pitfalls of home learning. And
Okay.
you sometimes see homeworks being set that it's just more of the same. It's not really moving anything forward. And you start to question sort of, well, what was the real reason behind that? Was it just to actually fill a time slot or whatever? Whereas actually what we should be looking at in terms of home learning is activities are going to build people's learning skills, so it might make them become more reflective. It might create a sense of awe and wonder. It might generate some sort of thinking that means they're going to come maybe prepared for their learning or to consolidate what they've done before. Just something that's going to give them a learning experience as opposed to simply a doing experience.
Okay, so the themes running through what you've just said seems to be preparing them for their future learning or consolidating their learning, but you made the point that it can't just be the same. So am I right in thinking that they should apply their skills but in a different context to stretch them further?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think consolidation, it's a difficult term, isn't it? Because sometimes we just see that consolidation as the classic, well, you've done 5 questions, now do the next 5 questions. I sometimes think also there's the danger with home learning that you just give them work to complete from what you've done in the lesson, and that's punishing those kids who actually, for one reason or another, maybe aren't the quickest writers.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they weren't thinking or learning in the lesson, but they're being punished for being slower in terms of their actual product.
Okay.
So I think it's important that you do strike a right balance in terms of consolidating and putting in different contexts.
Okay, so they're enhancing their skills, they're not doing more of the same that won't get them anything else. Okay, so that's the consolidation, but thinking about preparing them for their learning then, there's a big kind of initiative around at the moment, which is to deliver content first so that you can spend more time applying in lessons. How can I use my home learning effectively to do this?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head completely there. It's so important really these days, particularly if you're in a school or an environment where lessons aren't particularly long. Sometimes you find that 20-30 minutes of a lesson can be spent delivering content, and you just think, well, actually that's just not that important in the grand scheme of things, because really those are the kind of bits of information that the teacher's not that useful for, or at least as useful for. The teacher can be really there to help guide, apply, question, and analyse and evaluate and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I think you've kind of struck it there with sort of front loading. So rather than looking at the old traditional approach of setting the home learning after the learning event in the classroom, let's look at doing it at the start, and then you're looking at these things. It may still be some form of consolidation. It's actually making that crucial link between the sequence of lessons, but it can also be in lots of other ways. It can be preparing to have something really, really exciting. I mean, if you'd like, I could throw a few examples out there which will help.
Please do.
Well, let's think of maybe you're a geography teacher, and let's say, for example, that you want to be looking at the sort of skills involved in developing world, less economic countries, and looking at sort of industries in those areas. Well, why not show them a YouTube video or set them some form of document or reading where they can sort of skim for gist and get the sense of maybe what a banana plantation in Ghana is like. Then when they come to the actual class, you can actually look at the real issues involved in this and maybe start looking in different contexts. So coffee plantations in Brazil, where there are some similarities, looking at differences. So instead of spending a whole lesson reading, they're doing actually applying and making it useful. And a very simple thing as a language teacher, of course, you might just do something as easy as actually getting students to look at some vocabulary ahead of the lesson, whether you've set a prescriptive list they can actually look up, or they're actually setting their own agenda for their learning in the lesson, so that when you actually come to the class, you can focus on something, the application of language and grammar, as opposed to dwelling on looking up at every single word in the dictionary, which is taking time out, which could be a crucial sort of learning opportunity.
Yeah, you've made me think there, because the best history lessons are when people are discussing and debating. So if, for example, as today we were discussing interpretations of Mary Tudor, should she be considered Bloody Mary, the best thing to do then would be they can appreciate the content beforehand, so that I as a teacher can concentrate on helping them evaluate their debates, use the information properly. Maybe, I'm sure there'll be cases where they might make some mistakes with the content at home, but then I can rectify those as the lesson goes on. But at least I can focus on where I'm going to have most impact upon them.
Yeah, and I think it's about developing good learning habits. So maybe the first time you do this kind of activity, you may not get the output that you're looking for. But if you model it, you show them what you're aiming for, then the more times you do this, and the more it becomes intrinsic to the lesson learning model, kids actually start to value the home learning a lot more. You'll probably find your completion rates are included because they don't want to miss out on what's exciting learning in the lesson. But more important than just completion rates, you actually get kids thinking.
Yeah.
And that's got to be the holy grail of the learning.
Yeah, and you've got me talking of thinking. You've got me thinking now, because students always seem to enjoy, and in fact are far more engaged learning about something that they've heard about in advance. So with my year 9s recently, I was talking about who assassinated Kennedy and the various theories there. Because they had all heard about that assassination, they were instantly engaged in that. So therefore, now there are other things that we teach that they won't have heard about. So we've got the Watergate scandal coming up, which they would have heard less of. But if I can get them to watch these YouTube clips and engage with this content in advance, they'll come in with that same level of engagement as when they come in with a question on the board that they might know something about.
And how many times in a learning context, in all schools, do you hear people say, particularly say sixth formers, why can't they be independent learners? Well, because we're not allowing them to develop that independence by giving them all the content in the lesson. Get them to do the content outside to develop the sort of learning skills so they actually do that, so the learning becomes purposeful. You create that sense of awe and wonder, you excite them, you engage them in the lesson, and suddenly you might find that a lot of those independent learning skills become just part and parcel of what is good teaching. Now I'm talking sixth form, but of course that works everywhere. That's not to say there aren't the odd pitfall, though. There isn't the odd pitfall. I mean, I certainly know there are examples when I've seen people do this, myself included, where, well, we set something which is really crucial to the lesson, but what happens if it hasn't been completed? Well, yeah, I think there's perhaps a sanction involved somewhere, but don't let the student opt out of the learning, because effectively the student chooses not to do it. It's because they're choosing to opt out of the learning opportunity. So have a prepared version for them. This is what I expected you could have completed, therefore you can now engage in my lesson, but there will be a consequence for what you didn't do.
In other words, don't let them opt out again by saying, well, now you can't do anything, because then they're opting out twice.
Precisely.
Yeah. And also I think this links with what Lisa was talking about on the previous podcast, because, ultimately in more subjects than students realise, we want them to be creative. History, geography are not always seen by students as lessons where they need to show their creativity, but it's just, painting a picture in art is a similar skill to writing an essay in history. You need to be creative. Now, you can't just tell students, it's 9 o'clock, right, for the next 50 minutes we're going to be creative. You can't do that. Your brain needs kind of warming up beforehand. So if you give a concept to think about in advance, it's almost like your brain is ready and has thought about it either consciously or subconsciously, so that when it comes to the lesson, they're more likely to be creative quicker.
Yeah, and again, I'll take my language example. If you're spending your whole time in a lesson using your dictionary to look at word after word after word and working on the more less creative elements of the lesson, when are you ever going to engage that other side of the brain and get students to actually apply the language and focus on communication, which ultimately is what we want them to achieve?
Well, Jonathan, you've really helped me think about my future home learning.
Good to hear it.